Good afternoon, I'm a modern warfare historian, and welcome to something unrelated to what I usually do. Today I woke up and I was like, hey, you know what would be cool? To go on the internet and express my not asked opinion on what new campaigns would be cool to see on Enlisted. At first I want to do this on the Enlisted forum, but then I realized that it will take me an entire day to write everything on a single post, and on YouTube I could go a little more in detail on the matter. Keep in mind that some of these might not be completely balanced or 100% realistic. So here we are, let's get started with my personal list of campaigns. Why just talk about the Second World War when there are a ton of conflict interesting to look at just before it? I will not cover the various colonial wars and insurrection as those would be too much unbalanced. First one, the Spanish Civil War. Factions, Republicans versus Nationalists. Units, for the Republicans, the People's Army and the International Brigades, with Soviet Union units as a premium. For the Nationalists, the Phalangists and the Italians, with the Corpo Truppe Volontarie, basically the Volunteer to Corps, with German units as a premium. If I had to choose a specific engagement, I would go for the Battle of Guadalajara, the Aragon Offensive or the Catalonia Offensive. These are in order to make the Italian involvement more realistic, and these battles had tanks in them, something not to be taken for granted in this period. I will not cover the infantry equipment, but if we had to talk about tanks, for the Republicans, I will add the Trubia Naval, that was a popular front manufactured tank, then the BT-5, and as the last tank available, the T-26. For the Nationalists, I will add the L-333 Tankette, the Carro Veloce 35LF Lanzallamas Compactor, basically compact flamethrower, and as the last unit I will either add the Panzer I Breda, that was a Panzer I modified with the Breda 20mm gun, or add a captured T-26. I will also add the Soviet 45mm AT gun for the Republicans, and for the Nationalists, the Italian 47-32 as static weapons. For planes for the Republicans, I will add the Devotine D510 as the first plane, the I-16 as a better fighter, the Tupolev SB as a bomber, and as an attacker, either the Polyakov RZ or the R5. For the Nationalists, as an early fighter, the Italian Fiat CR32, the BF-109 as a better fighter, the Savoia Marchetti SM-79 as a bomber, and the Junger's 87 Stuka as an attacker. The Second Sino-Japanese War. Factions, Chinese versus Japanese. As for tanks, for the Chinese, the German-built Panzer I, the Renault FT armed with a 37mm gun, and the Vickers 6-ton tank. For the Japanese, the Type 94 Tankette, the Type 95 Hago, and the Type 89 Aigo. For the planes, for the Chinese, the Polyakov I-16 and the P-40 Warhawk, flown by the Flying Tigers, while for the Japanese, the Mitsubishi A5M Claude and the Nakajima Ki-27. Since I'm not an expert on the matter, I will not go too much in details of this campaign. Taking goal. Factions, Soviet Union versus Japan. As for planes, the Soviets, I will go again with the I-16, the Tupolev SB and the Polyakov R5. For the Japanese, I will go with the Nakajima Ki-27, the Mitsubishi Ki-21, and as a light bomber, the Mitsubishi Ki-30. As for tanks, for the Soviets, the BA-10, the BT-5 or the BT-7, and the T-26. For the Japanese, the Type 94 Tankette, the Type 95 Hago, and the Type 89 Aigo. Yes, I know that a lot of these units will be used in different campaigns, but this might be an interesting feature that you may be able to carry into a different campaign, upgraded vehicles from another one. Let me make an example. If you unlock the M1 Garand in Normandy campaign, you may also be able to use it from the start on another campaign in which America was involved, of course only if the Garand was included in the aforementioned campaign. That will mean no STG-44 spam during the Battle of France, of course. This might be interesting also for your upgraded tanks and planes. Now let's go to the Second World War. The war started with the German invasion of Poland, so let's start with that one. Factions, Poland versus Germany. For Polish tanks, the TK3 Tankette, the TKS Tankette, the 70P, and the Renault R35. For the Germans, the Panzer I, the Panzer II, the Panzer 35T, and the Panzer III with the short 37mm gun as the best tank. As for planes go, the Polish will have the PZL P11, the PZL 23, and the PZL 37 Los. For the Germans, the Bf-109, the Ju-87 Stuka, and the Heinkel 111. I know that the Polish planes may be a little overwhelmed, especially as the fighter is worse than the German counterpart. But hey, that's realistic. I was considering including the Battle of Norway for a possible campaign, but due to the lack of tanks available, I've decided not to include this. What about the Battle of France in 1940? Factions: France and Great Britain versus Germany, probably around the Battle of Arras. As for tanks, for the Allied, the Panhard 178, the AMR-33, the Saumur S-35 and the Sharpie 1. And for the British, the Crusader Mark IV, the Daimler Scout Car Dingo and the Matilda 2 tanks. For the Germans, the SDKFZ 221 and the 222, one to balance with the Dingo and the other with the Panhard, while the Panzer 1 to balance the AMR, and then the various Panzer 2, 3 and 4, with the addition of the Panzer 38T and the Stubb 3 Ausführung A. As for static emplacement, I will add for the Allied the Hotchkiss 25mm and the 2-pounder gun, while for the Germans the 2.8 cm Panzerbuchse 41 and the 3.7 Pak 36. I do not know if the 2.8 cm was used in France, but I have added it for balancing reason. As for planes go, for the Allied I will add the Morane-Saulnier MS-406, the Devotine D520 and the Hurricane, the Latécoeur 298, and as for bombers, the Bristol Blenheim. For the Germans, a couple of versions of the Bf-109, the Junkers 87 Stuka, and as bomber, either the Heinkel 111 or the Dornier 17. It might be interesting to think about a possible what-if scenario for Enlisted for Operation Sea Lion, but I will not cover this in the video. However, if you want a follow-up video with more scenarios, leave a comment, maybe even indicating what battle might be interesting. We already have the Battle of Moscow in the game, so I will not cover that one. However, it might be interesting to cover something in the desert. There might be a scenario on Operation E, the German invasion of Egypt, Operation Compass, Brevity, Battle Axe or Crusader. In any case, the faction will be the British against either the Italians alone or the Italians with the Germans. As for tanks, we could have the cruiser tanks and the Matildas versus the Italian L333 and the L335 tankettes, the M1139 and M1441, and in case the Germans get involved, also the Panzer IIs and Panzer IIIs. As for static guns, the British will have the 2-pounder and the 25-pounder artillery piece in anti-tank role. If we're talking about 1942 scenario, we might also see the 6-pounder. The Axis will have the Italian 4733, the German 37mm Pak, and maybe even the Flak 88 used as an anti-tank role. As for planes, we might see Gladiators, Hurricanes, Spitfires and P-40s as fighters, while Bristol Blenheims and Douglas Boston as bombers for the Allied. For the Axis, the Italian CR-32, the Macchi C-200, the C-202 and the Fiat G-50, with the addition of the Bf-109s if the Germans are here. As bombers go, I will add the Savoia Marchetti SM-79, the Stuka and the Kant Z-1007. We then can go to the Pacific Front, with either the Kokoda campaign or the Guadalcanal campaign. By the way, if you're interested in the Kokoda campaign, I'm covering it on the channel. Sadly, tanks will not be common here on the Japanese side as far as I know, but if tanks are available for the Japanese, those would be very light tankettes, while the Australians and the Americans could use M3 light tanks. As for planes, we might see a clash between P-40s and Wildcats against Mitsubishi A670s. Another interesting scenario might be the Dieppe raid. Factions, Anglo-Canadians against Germany. As for tanks, the Allied could master the Daimler Dingo Scout Car, the Bren Carrier and the Churchill Heavy Tank. The German, as far as I know, did not have any tanks, but we could add the 10th Panzer Division as it was in reserve in France at the time, therefore adding Panzer IIs, 3s and 4s. The Germans could also have the advantage on static heavy guns like the 88mm. As for planes go, the Allied will have Hurricanes 2C attackers, the Spitfire 5B as a fighter and the Bristol Blenheim as a bomber, while the Germans could have the Focke-Wulf 190s and the Bf-109s as fighter bombers and the Dornier 217s as bombers. Then we already have in-game the Tunisian campaign, and that's it for the early war period. For the second part of the war, we might have Stalingrad or Kursk. Honestly, I would prefer the second option, as the first one might be too similar to the Moscow campaign in terms of vehicles. As for the tanks, the Germany could use Panzer IVs and Stugs, and start bringing to the table the big cats, like the Tiger and the Panther, and maybe even the Ferdinand tank destroyer. For the Soviet, they might have the T-34-76, the Su-76, the KV-1 and either the Su-122 and the Su-152 to fight the big German machines. Here the Soviets could have the advantage in anti-tank guns, also to balance the fight. As for planes, the Germans could use the standard Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and some bombers, while the Soviets could use some various Yaks, MiGs, and the famous IL-2. Moving on the Western Front, we might see the invasion of Sicily. I know it might be similar to the Tunisian campaign that is already scheduled to be added in the game, but in the Sicily campaign we might see also the Italians that will bring to the fight their Semoventes and some advanced fighters escorting Stukas, while the Allied will reply with Shermans and, as far as aircraft goes, Mustangs and P-47s. The Normandy campaign is already in the game, so I'll skip that. We might see some fighting in Monte Cassino, with the Germans against the Allied. Sadly, the Axis will have probably just Stuks in the area, so I don't know how that could be balanced against a lot of Shermans. Maybe the solution would be to make the map as the Cassino mountain itself, therefore making armored combat difficult. However, I do feel that adding bombers here might be a slightly controversial thing, for the bombing of a certain worship place. Moving to the other side of the war, the Philippines campaign, American versus Japanese, and maybe if the American win, we can have an ending video clip with the landing of MacArthur himself landing on the beaches. I do not know if the Japanese had tanks there, I guess light ones, but still it might be interesting also to play as the Filipinos, obviously equipped with American weapons. Returning to Europe, Operation Market Garden might be interesting, especially if we look at the Battle of Nijmegen, where we can see some German Kampfgruppe against 30 Corps from the British and the American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division. Or, in contrast, we might see the Hurtgen Forest as a scenario, ditching the British units and going full American against entrenched Germans. I guess Patton would have been happy to ditch Montgomery, but still. The Americans will master the standard deck of Shermans, P-51s and P-47s, against the classic formula of Panzer IVs, Stags, Bf-109s and Focke-Wulfs. Going into 1945, it might be interesting to have either Iwo Jima or Okinawa, simply to have the possibility of using American amphibious armored fighting vehicles, like the LVT series of vehicles that are already in War Thunder, so the models are already there. I would also like a late war Germany versus the Western Allied in 1945, like crossing the Rhine, or we might have a 1944 Battle of Scheldt Estuary with the Canadian First Army. And then, at last, the Battle of Berlin is already here. This brings an end to our video. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, even if it was off topic from what I usually cover on the channel. Yes, this will delay the other video planned for these weeks, the Let's Talk About episode on tanks. But hey, this morning I woke up wanting to do this video, so here I am. Again, if you like this idea, let me know in the comments. If you want that I do other videos on what should be added in video games, you just need to subscribe and tell me in the comments what game I should cover. And no, this will not replace the TNWH Twice gameplay series that will start in the next months. As always, for updates, go follow our website, our Telegram channel and our Instagram page. Thank you for watching, see you next time, and remember to never wake up with weird video ideas like this, as you would spend 4 hours of your life just on the script.